How we doing tonight? How we doing? How we doing? I'm gonna jump on in here for a little bit, get caught up on what's going on. Boy, they out here on them
You know, there's a moment in
fireworks.
diplomacy, and I saw it more than once sitting behind that desk in the Oval Office, where the most devastating thing a leader can do isn't attack, it's ignore. It's stand up in front of the entire world, lay out exactly what you believe, make it absolutely clear who you're talking about, and never once give them the dignity of hearing their own name. That's what Mark Carney did on July 1st, 2026,
Have I heard this one?
Canada Day, standing in front of thousands of his own people at LeBreton Flats Park in Ottawa. And I want to walk you through exactly what happened, because I think the implications of that day go much further than most people realize. Now, the Blue Bill actually traced the diplomatic pattern Carney has been developing since Davos in January,
Please come in, hitting
connecting
the like
several
button.
moments that most outlets treated as separate incidents. And what they mapped out gives this Canada Day speech a very different context than what you'd get from just watching the clips. But let's start at the beginning, because the timing alone tells you this was not an accident. See, July 1st wasn't just Canada's birthday. It was, by the terms written directly into the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, what we call CUSMA up north and USMCA down here, the mandatory 6-year review deadline. Every signatory had to declare, do you extend this deal to 2042, or do you open the door to renegotiation? Canada said, extend. Mexico said, extend. And the Trump administration, through Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, formally declined. On the same day that Mark Carney stood up and told his country they could give themselves far more than anyone could ever take away. Now tell me that timing wasn't deliberate. Tell me Carney didn't know exactly what Washington was about to announce when he chose those words. He's a former central banker. The man understands calendars, deadlines, and leverage. He understood that when the American side officially refused to extend the trade agreement Donald Trump himself signed in his first term, an agreement that covers $1.9 trillion in annual trade, the eyes of the financial world would be on North America. And he used that stage not to beg, not to threaten, not to name call. He used it to redefine what Canadian sovereignty sounds like in 2026. Now let me tell you what Carney actually said, because the words matter here. He talked about building big with Canadian workers, Canadian materials, and Canadian values. He talked about choosing Canadian produce, rediscovering the country's own landscapes, from the Cabot Trail to the Columbia Ice Field, from the Bay of Fundy to the Northern Lights. He called these small acts of solidarity, repeated millions of times, proving, and this is a direct paraphrase, that together Canadians can give themselves far more than anyone could ever take away. Then he went further. He said there will always be forces that want to divide us. And he said those forces forget a founding insight of Canada, that unity is not uniformity, that differences are strengths to be nurtured, not risks to be managed, and that Canadian values serve as an unshakable foundation. Now, who do you think he was talking about when he said forces that want to divide us. He didn't name anybody. He didn't have to, because every single Canadian watching that speech knew. And more importantly, every foreign policy desk in Washington knew. This is the rhetorical equivalent of looking someone straight in the eye from across a crowded room and making sure they understand you see exactly what they're doing without giving them the satisfaction of a confrontation they can spin. Now look, I want to be fair here. Some folks will argue, and I think they have a reasonable point, that Trump's decision not to extend CUSMA was a negotiating posture, not a death sentence for the trade relationship. The agreement doesn't actually expire until 2036. Annual reviews continue. No one's pulled the withdrawal trigger, which would require 6 months formal notice. And there's an argument that Trump wants concessions, wants to address what his team calls shortcomings, and that declining the extension is leverage, not destruction. I understand that logic. I've used leverage myself. You have to in negotiations. But here's where I part ways. There's a difference between leverage and recklessness. When you take the most successful trilateral trade relationship on the continent, one that supports 13 million American jobs, according to the Business Roundtable, and you publicly call it something you'd rather terminate, you're not just negotiating with Ottawa and Mexico City. You're negotiating with every manufacturer in Michigan, every farmer in Wisconsin, every auto parts supplier in Ohio who depends on integrated North American supply chains. And the message Carney sent on July 1st was simple. Canada is not going to sit around waiting for you to decide whether you value this partnership. Canada is going to start building for itself. And this is where things start to get complicated, because Carney isn't just managing a relationship with Washington. He's managing a country that is at this very moment asking itself whether it wants to stay together. On October 19th, Albertans are going to vote in a referendum, not on separation directly, but on whether to begin the legal process toward a binding referendum on separation. Premier Danielle Smith put that question on the ballot alongside 9 others dealing with immigration and constitutional issues. Now, Smith herself says she supports Alberta remaining in Canada. Polling from the Angus Reid Institute in late May showed 60% of Albertans would vote to stay. 35% would vote to begin the separation process. But here's what troubles me. 51% of Albertans said they found the question confusing, and 56% said Smith had handled the whole issue poorly. The Blue Bill assembled a timeline showing how Smith's government systematically lowered signature thresholds and extended collection windows for the pro-separation petition before this question ever reached the ballot. A sequence that raises real questions about whether this referendum was organic democratic pressure or manufactured political theater. Carney called it a dangerous bluff. I think he's right. You don't play with the structural integrity of a nation to manage your political base. So Carney walked onto that stage in Ottawa carrying all of this: the CUSMA deadline, the Alberta referendum looming, a Quebec provincial election on October 5th where separatist sentiment is resurfacing, a relationship with Washington that has deteriorated from the Davos rupture speech in January, where Carney told the World Economic Forum that the old rules-based order is not coming back, that middle powers need to stop pretending and start building their own strength, to Trump responding that Canada lives because of the United States, to a series of tariff escalations, disinvitations, and public insults. And what did Carney do with all of that weight? He gave a speech about kindness, about connection, about courage. He quoted Jeremy Hansen, the Canadian astronaut who flew around the moon on Artemis II, who told the crowd that humanity's strength lies in collaboration. He praised the 5 Canadian police officers killed in the line of duty that year. He celebrated the founding conviction of Canadian Confederation, that together a country can build something greater than the sum of its parts. And every single word of it was a rebuke of the politics of domination, bullying, and division, without ever descending into those politics himself. The Blue Bill reported that a senior Trump administration official during the same day Kuzma briefing specifically accused Canada of being less cooperative than Mexico, saying Ottawa was in a different position. And that framing tells you everything about how Washington received Carney's message. Now let me tell you what I think happens from here, because this is where the real stakes are. The Kuzma renegotiation is going to be brutal. The Trump administration wants more manufacturing on American soil, wants to stop Chinese goods from entering through the Canadian and Mexican back doors, and has shown very little willingness to remove the steel, aluminum, auto, and lumber tariffs that Canada considers a violation of the agreement's spirit. The Bank of Canada projects GDP will finish 2026 roughly 1.5% lower than its pre-tariff trajectory. Canada's goods exports to the United States fell 5.8% in 2025. Youth unemployment is sitting at 13.4%. The economic pain is real. And the political question is whether Carney can sustain a posture of dignified resistance when his own economy is bleeding. Some analysts think Republicans want a deal by Labor Day to campaign on before the midterms. Others think these talks drag well into 2027. Carney himself said something revealing last week. He said that with Trump, you're not close to making a deal, and then you make a deal. That tells me Carney is still leaving the door open. He's not burning bridges. He's standing on his side of the bridge and making very clear what the price of crossing is. Meanwhile, the Alberta referendum will test whether Carney's unity message has legs in the part of Canada that feels most alienated from Ottawa. If Albertans vote decisively to remain, and I think they will, it strengthens his hand enormously, both domestically and at the Kuzma table. If the vote is closer than expected, it exposes the fracture that Trump's team will absolutely try to exploit. Here's the honest truth, folks. What Mark Carney did on July 1st wasn't just a good speech. It was a strategic act of Democratic leadership in a moment when Democratic leadership is in dangerously short supply. He showed you can stand up to the most powerful country in the world without throwing a punch. You can defend your sovereignty without closing the door to partnership. You can call out division without becoming divisive. And you can celebrate diversity, real, lived, pluralistic diversity, as the foundation of national strength, rather than a weakness to be managed or a talking point to be discarded. Now, I don't agree with every decision Mark Carney makes. He walked back some of Canada's climate targets this week, admitting emissions will be higher in the short term than previously projected. And that concerns me as someone who spent considerable time working on environmental policy. I think there's a real tension between his economic nationalism and the kind of open, integrated North American economy that made all three of our countries more prosperous. But what I will not do is pretend that what he said on Canada Day was anything less than a master class in how a democratic leader communicates under pressure. Because here's what I learned in 8 years in the White House. The alliances that hold are the ones where both sides feel respected. The partnerships that endure are the ones where disagreement doesn't become domination. And the leaders who matter, the ones history actually remembers, are the ones who found a way to tell the truth clearly, firmly, and with enough grace that the door stays open for the conversation that has to come next. Mark Carney left that door open on July 1st. The question now is whether anyone in Washington is willing to walk through it. Because if they're not, it won't just be Canada that pays the price. It'll be the 13 million Americans whose jobs depend on the relationship that's being treated like a bargaining chip. And that's not a Canadian problem. That's our problem. And we'd better start acting like it. You know, there are moments in this country's story where the Supreme Court doesn't just interpret the law, it reminds us who we are. And what happened on June 30th, 2026 was one of those moments. Now, I've been around long enough to understand that not every legal battle changes the direction of a nation. Some do, some don't. But when the highest court in the land votes 6-3 to strike down a sitting president's executive order, an order that would have redefined who gets to be called an American, well, that's not just a legal ruling. That's a constitutional earthquake. And I want to walk you through exactly why this matters, because the details here are going to surprise you. The Blue Bill traced the full legal lineage of this case, one of the few places that'll show you the receipts before asking you to take sides. From the 14th Amendment through Wong Kim Ark, all the way to Trump versus Barbara. And when you see how far back this principle goes, you start to understand what was really at stake. Because this wasn't just about immigration policy. This was about whether a president can, with a stroke of a pen, on his very first day in office, override 158 years of constitutional law. And the answer the court gave was thundering. But here's the thing most people aren't talking about yet: the dissents. 3 justices disagreed. And what they wrote, that's where the real fight begins. We'll come back to that in a moment. Now look, to understand what just happened, you've got to understand what President Trump was trying to do. On January 20th, 2025, his first day back in office, he signed an executive order attempting to end birthright citizenship for children born in the United States to parents who are either undocumented or here on temporary visas. Think about that for a second. Before the ink was dry on the inaugural address, the first official act was an attempt to rewrite who counts as an American. Now, I respect the office of the presidency. I held it. I know the weight of those decisions. But I also know that executive power has limits, and those limits exist for a reason. The 14th Amendment says it plain as day. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. That language was put there after the Civil War for a reason. The men who wrote it had just fought a war over whether human beings could be treated as property. And they decided deliberately, intentionally, that citizenship would be broad, not narrow, not conditional, not narrow, not conditional, not something a president could take away with a memo. And every single lower court that reviewed this executive order agreed. Every one. Federal district judges, 2 appellate circuits, they all said the same thing. One judge called it blatantly unconstitutional. That's not a close call. That's a flashing red light. So let me walk you through what the Supreme Court actually said, because the reasoning matters as much as the result. Chief Justice John Roberts, and remember, this is the conservative justice appointed by George W. Bush, wrote the majority opinion. He was joined by Justice Barrett, another conservative and a Trump appointee, along with all 3 liberal justices, Kagan, Sotomayor, and Jackson. That's 5 votes on constitutional grounds. Now, Justice Kavanaugh, also a Trump appointee, agreed with the outcome, but took a different path. He said the executive order didn't violate the 14th Amendment directly, but that it violated federal law, a statute Congress passed in 1940 that codifies birthright citizenship. So even Kavanaugh said the president couldn't do this. That's 6 justices total telling the White House, no, you cannot redefine American citizenship by executive order. Roberts grounded his opinion in Wong Kim Ark, the landmark 1898 case. A man born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrant parents was denied re-entry but that it violated federal law, a statute Congress passed in 1940 that codifies birthright citizenship. So even Kavanaugh said the president couldn't do this. That's 6 justices total telling the White House, no, you cannot redefine American citizenship by executive order. Roberts grounded his opinion in Wong Kim Ark, the landmark 1898 case. A man born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrant parents was denied re-entry to the United States. The court ruled that because he was born on American soil, he was an American citizen, period. Roberts wrote that the framers of the 14th Amendment extended the promise of citizenship to, quote, every freeborn person in this land. And this is where things start to get complicated. Because the 3
Can y'all
dissenting
please hit the like
justices
button for me?
didn't just disagree. They tried to rewrite the history of the 14th Amendment itself. Justice Thomas wrote a 91-page
Double tap the face of your phone or hit the 3 dots at the top right corner.
91 pages, arguing that the Citizenship Clause was never meant to cover anyone except freed slaves and their descendants. Let me tell you something about constitutional interpretation. When you spend 91 pages trying to explain why the plain text of an amendment doesn't mean what it says, that tells you something. Justice Gorsuch joined Thomas. Justice Alito wrote separately, calling the majority opinion a serious mistake and raising concerns about birth tourism, women traveling to the United States specifically to give birth so their children gain citizenship. Now, is birth tourism a real phenomenon? Yes. Does it deserve a serious policy conversation? Absolutely. But here's the honest truth. The way to address that is through Congress, through legislation, through the democratic process, not through a president deciding unilaterally to override the Constitution. And that's what Roberts understood. He pointed out that Congress has had over a century and a half to narrow the definition of birthright citizenship. When they wrote the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1952, they could have added a domicile requirement. They didn't. That silence speaks volumes. When the people's representatives choose not to restrict a right over 150 years of lawmaking, a president doesn't get to do it for them with a pen. That's not leadership, that's overreach. And I've learned a few things about the difference between the two. Now, what concerns me, and this is something I think every American should be paying attention to, is what this moment reveals about the state of our institutions. We've got to remember that the system worked here. The courts did their job. Lower courts blocked the order. The Supreme Court affirmed. 6 justices from across the ideological spectrum said, no, this crosses the line. But the fact that it got this far should worry us. An estimated 255,000 children are born every year to non-citizen parents in the United States. Under this executive order, those children would have been denied citizenship. Some of them might have become stateless, born in America, but citizens of nowhere. Think about what that means for a child. Think about what kind of country does that. And here's what really keeps me up at night, the reaction. President Trump posted on Truth Social calling the ruling too bad for our country and immediately called on Congress to legislate an end to birthright citizenship. He said, and I want to be precise here, No long and unwieldy constitutional amendment is necessary. But the majority opinion strongly suggests otherwise. When 6 justices root their decision in the text of the 14th Amendment, you don't get around that with a regular piece of legislation. You need a constitutional amendment, which requires 2/3 of both chambers. The president either knows that and is being misleading, or doesn't know it, and that's a different kind of problem entirely. Let me tell you why the politics of this matter. Senator Lindsey Graham has already said he'll make ending birthright citizenship a top priority in the Judiciary Committee. Senator Katie Britt has co-sponsored legislation to do exactly that. Vice President Vance called the ruling a major mistake. Now, I understand the political incentives. Immigration is an emotional issue. It moves voters. And there are real, legitimate concerns about the immigration system that deserve serious attention. But there's a difference between reforming immigration policy and attacking the constitutional foundation of citizenship itself. The Blue Bill laid out the congressional math on this weeks ago. The 2/3 threshold in both chambers makes a constitutional amendment virtually impossible with the current composition. And any legislative workaround would almost certainly face the same fate in the courts. And I think some of the people pushing this know that. Which means this isn't really about changing the law. It's about the message. It's about telling a certain segment of voters that their leaders are fighting for them, even when the fight has no realistic path to victory. That's not governance, that's performance. And the American people deserve better than political theater dressed up as constitutional reform. I spent 8 years in the Oval Office trying to get things done across party lines. Welfare reform, balanced budgets, trade agreements. And the one thing I learned is that when a leader chooses the fight they know they can't win over the compromise that might actually help people, it's the people who lose. So where does this go from here? And this is the part that most people aren't thinking about carefully enough. There are really 3 paths forward. First, the legislative route. Graham and Britt will push their bill. It might get traction in the Senate. Stranger things have happened. But it faces enormous hurdles in the courts, even if it passes. The Supreme Court just said the 14th Amendment guarantees this right. Legislation that tries to circumvent an amendment is on shaky constitutional ground, and the justices know it. Kavanaugh left a small door open in his concurrence by suggesting Congress could amend federal statute. But even that's a narrow opening that most legal scholars believe wouldn't survive judicial review after this ruling. Second, the constitutional amendment route. 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures. Public opinion polls consistently show that a majority of Americans support birthright citizenship. The NBC News survey around this ruling found 54% say being born here is important to American identity. You're not getting a constitutional amendment through that landscape. Third, and this is the one that worries me most, the slow erosion approach. You don't overturn the ruling. You just make life harder for the people it protects. You create bureaucratic barriers. You challenge documentation. You use executive agencies to drag their feet on processing. That's the quiet route, And in some ways, it's more dangerous than the loud one because it happens without a headline and without a Supreme Court case to stop it. Here's where I come down on all of this. I believe in secure borders. I believe in an immigration system that works. I've said that my whole career, and I signed legislation to back it up. But I also believe that when a child is born on American soil, that child is American. That's not a partisan position. That's the position of the United States Constitution, affirmed by a conservative Chief Justice, upheld by 2 Trump-appointed justices, and rooted in a legal tradition that stretches back to English common law and forward through the most transformative amendment in our nation's history. Justice Jackson wrote something in her concurrence that's worth sitting with. She pointed out the deep irony of Justice Thomas arguing that the 14th Amendment, the amendment that guaranteed citizenship to freed slaves, should be read so narrowly that it excludes millions born on American soil. After decades of advocating for a colorblind constitution, Thomas suddenly argued the Citizenship Clause was a race-conscious remedy with limited reach. That contradiction matters because it reveals how these arguments actually work. They start with the answer they want and work backward to find a justification. That's not how constitutional law is supposed to function. The beauty of the 14th Amendment is its breadth. It was written by men who understood that America's definition of citizenship had been too narrow for too long. And they fixed it, not with fine print, but with a promise. All persons born in the United States, all. That word was chosen for a reason. And this week, the Supreme Court honored that choice. The question now isn't whether this right survives, it already has. The question is whether we as Americans will have the courage to defend the institutions that protect it. Because that's what self-governance demands. Not perfection, not agreement, but a shared commitment to the rules that hold us together. And that, my friends, is worth fighting for.
If you sit more than 6 hours a day,
Can I get y'all to hit the like button,
you need this
please?
cushion. I bought this ergonomic
Happy 4th of
memory foam
July.
seat cushion thinking it would just add a little comfort. But
A file was deleted. A briefing vanished from a government server within hours of being drafted. Nobody has explained why. And the reason nobody has explained why is because the answer points to a country most people in the West have stopped watching. Not Iran, not Russia. A NATO member sitting quietly on the map, building a stealth fighter, arming a new air defense shield inside Syria, and positioning itself to become the single most consequential power in the Middle East for the next 50 years. Stay with me for the next 30 minutes, because by the end of this, you will understand why the conversation everyone is having about this region is the wrong conversation entirely. For 2 decades, the story never changed. Iran was the villain. Iran was the existential menace. Every think tank report, every intelligence briefing, every cable news panel pointed east toward Tehran, as though the entire future of the Middle East hinged on one country's nuclear ambitions. And for a while, that story held together. But stories that hold together for a long time have a way of blinding the people who tell them. While the entire Western strategic class kept its eyes locked on Iran, another power was doing something far more dangerous. It was being patient, it was building, it was waiting. That power is Turkey. And a growing number of independent military analysts, including retired officers who spent their careers inside the machinery of American defense planning, now argue that the entire premise of Western Middle East strategy has been pointed in the wrong direction for years. Let me translate that into plain language. Imagine you're playing chess, and you've spent the whole game staring at your opponent's queen, convinced that's where the danger is coming from. Meanwhile, a quiet pawn on the other side of the board has been marching forward, one square at a time, completely unnoticed, until suddenly it reaches the final row and transforms into something far more powerful than the piece you were watching all along. That is what critics of the current strategic consensus say has happened with Turkey. Here's the case they make. Ask yourself one simple question. Across the last 1,000 years, who has actually dominated the Middle East for most of that time? Not the Arabs, not the West. The answer, again and again, comes back to two civilizations, the Turks and the Persians. Anyone who has spent real time in the region has heard the same argument play out in coffee shops and living rooms from Istanbul to Tehran. Turks will tell you the great architecture of the Islamic world is theirs. Iranians will tell you it's Persian. Arabs in these conversations are treated as almost incidental. The subtext is always the same. We are the ones who actually built and ran this civilization. That is not just cultural pride. It is a signal about how these two nations see their own destiny. And here's the part that should make anyone watching the region sit up straight. Both of these historic powers are now, in different ways and for different reasons, hostile toward Israel. For years, Israeli and American strategists treated Iran as the singular existential threat, the one power capable of truly threatening the Jewish state's survival. But a growing chorus of analysts, most prominently retired Colonel Douglas Macgregor, has been making an argument that reverses decades of conventional wisdom. According to Macgregor, the next Middle Eastern superpower will be neither Iran nor Israel, but Turkey. This is a striking reversal from someone who once viewed Iran as the region's rising military giant. So what changed his mind? Turkey, in his assessment, has assembled a combination of advantages that Iran simply doesn't match in full. Massive population, central geography that touches Europe, the Caucasus, the Middle East, and Central Asia all at once, a rapidly growing domestic arms industry, and a leadership structure under President Erdogan that plans in terms of decades, not election cycles. Let me translate that into plain language. Most governments, including most democracies, operate on short political horizons. Leaders think about the next election, the next budget cycle, the next news cycle. What analysts like Macgregor argue is that Ankara is playing a different game entirely, one measured in generations, with a single long-term objective, becoming the dominant power in the Middle East. Pair that kind of patience with a military that some analysts rank among the strongest on earth, and you start to see why voices inside Israel's own strategic establishment have begun sounding genuinely alarmed. This isn't abstract theorizing. It is grounded in events that have already happened, and nowhere is that shift more visible than in Syria. After the fall of the Assad government, Israeli forces moved into the vacuum with overwhelming force. Naval assets destroyed, air bases hit, weapons depots dismantled. Even the presidential palace struck. From Israel's perspective, this was framed as a security necessity, a way to prevent a fractured post-revolutionary Syria from becoming a launching pad for future threats. But critics of that campaign argue it was calculated for something else entirely, to keep Syria weak and fragmented indefinitely, unable to defend its own skies, and available as an open corridor for future strikes against Iran. Here is where the miscalculation, according to these same analysts, becomes apparent. Whoever assumed Syrian airspace would remain permanently open and undefended got the story wrong. Turkey moved. Reports now indicate a significant Turkish military buildup at the T4 airbase near Palmyra, complete with advanced air defense systems, surveillance drones, and armed drones with extended strike range. Let me translate what that actually means on the ground. For years, Syrian airspace functioned as an open highway, a corridor that allowed aircraft to move freely toward targets in Iraq and Iran. What's being built now is effectively a toll booth on that highway, one with teeth. Any aircraft that wants to pass through now risks a direct confrontation with a modern, combat-hardened, NATO-grade military. That is not a small development. That is a fundamental rewrite of the regional map. And this is exactly why the assumption that the war between Israel and Iran is somehow finished deserves serious scrutiny. It is not finished. It may be paused. It may be quieter than it was at its peak. But the underlying conflict is very much alive. A massive Iranian missile barrage fired in response to earlier Israeli strikes already demonstrated that this fire is nowhere near extinguished, regardless of what any single official chooses to say publicly. When an Israeli minister recently suggested Iran was on the verge of economic and political collapse under the weight of sustained pressure, that claim ran directly against the available evidence. By most independent assessments, Iran today is arguably more militarily capable and in some ways more politically stable internally than it was before this latest round of conflict began. It remains economically connected to two of the world's most powerful states, China and Russia. That is the backdrop against which any serious conversation about Turkey has to happen. Because Israel is no longer looking at one major regional adversary. It is potentially looking at two of the most capable state powers in the region, broadly aligned against it, even if their interests with each other diverge sharply elsewhere. So what has the American response actually been? By most accounts, the Trump administration has tried to walk a strange tightrope, keep Erdogan engaged and cooperative, while trying to drive a wedge between Turkey and Iran. One of the stranger proposals that reportedly circulated involved using Sunni Islamist factions inside post-Assad Syria as a fighting force against Hezbollah in Lebanon. On the surface, this fits a pattern Israeli strategists have favored for decades. The idea that regional rivals fighting each other benefits Israeli security more than any single dominant power emerging. But here's the catch that critics of the plan point to immediately. The moment you insert Syrian government-aligned forces into Lebanon, you are also, indirectly, inserting Turkish influence into Lebanon, because those forces operate under Ankara's shadow. And Turkey is not a passive observer here. It is watching every development in Lebanon, Syria, and the wider Caucasus, positioning itself for potential intervention, driven largely by one overriding regional obsession, preventing any form of independent Kurdish statehood. On that single point, Ankara and Tehran, despite their many disagreements, are in near total agreement. Neither wants a Kurdish state, and yet for years both Washington and Israel cultivated relationships with Kurdish factions as leverage against both Turkey and Iran. Which tells you the strategic incoherence here didn't start yesterday. When American officials describe Erdogan as a friend and a partner they get along with personally, critics argue that framing badly misreads how states actually operate. International politics is not run on personal rapport. It is run on interests, and Turkey's interests are not mysterious. Ankara has increasingly signaled that it views Syria as sitting within its natural sphere of influence, and northern Iraq the same way. During the long American occupation of Iraq, Turkish military officers reportedly told their American counterparts, without hesitation, that cities like Erbil and Kirkuk were, in their view, Turkish cities. That wasn't offhand commentary. It reflected a historical claim rooted in the fact that the Ottoman Empire controlled most of the Arabian Peninsula until relatively recently in historical terms. These aspirations, according to analysts tracking Ankara's posture, are not nostalgia. They are active strategic planning. There's also a layer of regional rivalry that rarely gets discussed openly. Turkish officials, according to several analysts who track the relationship closely, are reportedly frustrated that Iran has effectively positioned itself as the leading anti-Israel voice in the Islamic world, a role Ankara historically saw as its own. This is part of why Turkey's NATO membership matters far less to its actual strategic direction than most Western commentary assumes. On paper, NATO membership is significant. In practice, critics argue Turkey's cultural and historical center of gravity.
Can I get y'all? It's 96 people in here. I only have 36 likes. Can I hit y'all to hit the like button? If you're on your computer, you can hit those three dots at the top right corner. Or you can double tap the face of your phone. Double tap.
It's firmly in the Middle East and Central Asia, not Western Europe. Ankara is looking east and south, not west, and NATO membership functions more as a tool of convenience than a defining identity. And despite everything, Turkish officials, according to several analysts who track the relationship closely, are reportedly frustrated that Iran has effectively positioned itself as the leading anti-Israel voice in the Islamic world, a role Ankara historically saw as its own. This is part of why Turkey's NATO membership matters far less to its actual strategic direction than most Western commentary assumes. On paper, NATO membership is significant. In practice, critics argue Turkey's cultural and historical center of gravity sits firmly in the Middle East and Central Asia, not Western Europe. Ankara is looking east and south, not west, and NATO membership functions more as a tool of convenience than a defining identity. And despite everything, Turkey has been careful not to provoke a genuine confrontation with Russia. The two nations have fought each other repeatedly across centuries, and both sides, after all that history, appear to have concluded that direct conflict serves neither of them. So instead of confrontation, Ankara has cultivated a working relationship with Moscow, one built on mutual convenience rather than trust. That positioning is part of why some analysts describe Turkey as the 600-pound gorilla sitting quietly in the room while Washington tries to construct elaborate arrangements on Israel's behalf. From the Israeli side, some officials reportedly view proposals to bring Turkish-aligned forces into Lebanon with genuine alarm, essentially asking whether Washington understands what it would be inviting in. And from the Iranian side, the conclusion drawn is blunt, that American policymakers fundamentally misunderstand the region, its history, and its actual balance of power. That confusion shows up clearly in the contradictory signals coming out of Washington. Reports of a Syrian military buildup near the Lebanese border raised immediate questions, especially once they appeared to intensify following certain public comments from the American president. At first, that kind of talk sounded like the sort of off-the-cuff remark that gets forgotten within a news cycle. But when the same idea kept resurfacing, analysts began treating it less as a slip and more as a deliberate trial balloon. Several competing explanations emerged. Some argued the buildup was defensive, a precaution against pro-Assad remnants operating out of Lebanon. Others pointed to the ongoing narcotics trade across that border as the real motivation. Still others suggested it was about controlling the flow of weapons toward Hezbollah through Syrian territory. The uncertainty itself tells you something. Nobody, including many people close to the situation, seems entirely sure what the actual objective is. Then came public praise from the American president directed at Erdogan, along with talk of a major potential gift: access to F-35 fighter jets. That's when speculation sharpened considerably. Was there an actual negotiation underway in which advanced American military technology was being offered in exchange for Turkish-aligned Syrian forces moving into Lebanon to confront Hezbollah directly? It's worth noting that Syria's current leadership has publicly stated it does not want a war with Hezbollah, and has reportedly warned Lebanese officials not to place excessive trust in Israeli intentions. Which raises a genuine structural question. How much independent agency does that leadership actually have, versus how much depends on incentives being offered by outside powers? One incentive already on the table is real: the approval of a $700 million sale of jet engines for Turkey's domestically produced fighter aircraft. Turkey has been trying for years to complete a fully indigenous fifth-generation combat aircraft, but has lacked the ability to manufacture its own high-performance jet engines. That approval strongly suggests Washington hoped to purchase some form of political cooperation with it. Let me translate that into plain language. This is the geopolitical version of paying for a favor in advance and hoping the other side follows through later. But here's the problem with that strategy, according to critics who study Turkish decision-making closely. If Ankara is acting purely in its own interest, and every indication suggests it is, the rational move is simple: take the engines, install them in Turkish aircraft, say whatever is necessary to keep the relationship warm, and then quietly do nothing further in Lebanon. Take the benefit, deliver nothing, walk away. Washington has watched similar patterns play out before in this region, most notably with promises made to Kurdish allies that were later abandoned once they were no longer strategically convenient, which raises the deeper structural question hanging over the entire region. What is the actual American objective here? By many accounts, there isn't one coherent strategy, just a single reflexive instinct: support Israel, without a clearly defined endpoint. That absence of a defined strategy becomes especially costly when you look honestly at what has already unfolded in the recent conflict with Iran. The most capable military establishment in the world was not able to force Iran into submission. That is not a statement about the courage or competence of the individual soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines involved. It is a statement about strategic planning. A basic look at the terrain should have made the difficulty obvious from the outset. Iran is roughly the size of Western Europe, home to more than 90 million people. Its southern regions are largely desert and offer little strategic value if captured. Everything that actually matters sits in the north, ringed by mountains that make any conventional ground invasion extraordinarily difficult. Given that reality, the obvious question that should have been asked before any bombing campaign began was simple: what exactly are we trying to destroy, and what specific outcome does destroying it produce? By most independent assessments, no clear, convincing answer to that question ever existed. And now the practical reality on the ground has demonstrated several things beyond serious dispute. Iran has shown it can threaten to close the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important choke points for global energy shipping. It maintains underground facilities that are extremely difficult to destroy through airstrikes alone. And it has demonstrated the capability to strike energy infrastructure across the Gulf. Once those facts are on the table, the strategic argument for continuing military pressure becomes very hard to sustain. But the disappearance of a strong argument does not automatically mean the disappearance of the underlying momentum toward continued conflict. There remains significant institutional appetite for maintaining an American military footprint in the region, in part because an enormous amount of money moves through defense contracts tied to these deployments. Over the last quarter century of conflict in the Middle East, a great deal of private fortune has been built directly on the machinery of war. That financial incentive doesn't disappear just because the strategic logic has weakened. There's also a deeper historical lesson worth understanding here, and it explains exactly why the old playbook doesn't work anymore. For nearly 40 years, the United States kept roughly 275,000 troops stationed in Germany. The logic at the time was straightforward. If a war broke out with the Soviet Union, American forces could not cross the Atlantic fast enough to matter. So the solution was to station troops in Europe permanently, ready in advance. Let me translate that into plain language. It was essentially pre-positioning your defense because reinforcement would arrive too late to make a difference. But that entire logic depended on a world without long-range precision weapons. Today, tactical and long-range ballistic missiles, hypersonic weapons, and massed drone systems linked to real-time satellite surveillance have fundamentally changed the calculation. Iran has already demonstrated this principle in practice. Concentrate fixed military assets or large troop formations within range of a capable adversary, and those assets become vulnerable targets rather than deterrents. The same logic applies just as strongly to Eastern Europe against Russia as it does to the Gulf against Iran. Moving American bases further away doesn't solve the problem, because the response to that is simply longer-range missiles with larger warheads. The underlying vulnerability doesn't disappear, it just moves. Which leads to the uncomfortable conclusion that a growing number of independent analysts have arrived at. There may be no strategically coherent path forward in this region that doesn't eventually involve a significant American disengagement. That's not a popular thing to say in Washington policy circles, and it runs directly against decades of institutional momentum. But the facts on the ground, according to this school of thought, increasingly point in exactly that direction. So here's what I want you to sit with before you close this video. Everyone talking about the Middle East right now is arguing about Iran, about Israel, about Washington's next move. Almost nobody is talking seriously about the country that may actually end up shaping the next 50 years of this region more than any of them. I want you to think about one country we barely mentioned tonight, sitting quietly on the edges of every single storyline in this script: Azerbaijan. Turkey's closest strategic partner, sharing a border with Iran, deeply tied into the same energy corridors, the same military supply chains, the same regional chessboard. What role does Azerbaijan actually play in this unfolding power shift? And why does almost nobody in mainstream coverage mention it? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to see what you think, because the country everyone forgets to watch is usually the one that ends up mattering most.
Hit the like button, please.
Nobody in Washington wants you to see the actual scoreboard. So let's look at it anyway, right now, before anyone has a chance to spin it, and before the next news cycle buries this story under something louder and less important. A war that was sold to the American public as a swift, surgical, decisive knockout ended with the United States quietly agreeing to almost everything the other side wanted. Not a partial retreat, not a dignified compromise. A near total climb down, wrapped in the kind of diplomatic language that's specifically designed to make defeat sound like strategy. And once you start pulling on that thread, the entire official story falls apart in your hands. Stay with me for the next few minutes, because what I'm about to walk you through connects a failed CIA operation from 1961, a sitting government's private fear of becoming the next Herbert
be
Hoover,
rich.
and a fourth country you've probably never even considered, one that may be the biggest winner in this entire saga without lifting a finger. And once you see the full
Something clear
pattern
about the
laid out,
country?
you
Oh,
won't be
no.
able to watch the next headline out of this region the same way again. Let's start with the numbers, because numbers don't spin the way politicians do. The American strategy going in rested on one core assumption: overwhelming air power, precision strikes, and a fast decapitation of Iranian leadership would trigger a domino effect, regime collapse, a cooperative successor, a clean geopolitical win to put on the resume. That was the pitch. Here's what actually happened. Iran never needed to win this fight militarily. It only needed to survive it, absorb the punishment, and outlast Washington's political and economic patience. That's the entire ballgame, and that's exactly how it played out. The strikes landed, the facilities took damage, the casualties mounted on both sides, and Iran was still sitting at the table afterward. Except now with more leverage than when the whole thing started, not less. Picture two boxers. One throws every single punch in his arsenal in the first 2 rounds. Everything. No reserves. And by round 3, his arms are dead and he's praying for the bell. The other barely has to counter. He just has to stay upright. That is almost exactly the position the United States found itself in. It spent everything strategically and economically in the opening rounds. And now it's the one looking for the exit. Not because the other side delivered some devastating finishing blow, but because the cost of staying in the fight became unbearable for the side that started it. And this isn't the first time a dominant power has learned this lesson the hard way. Go back to 1956. Britain, France, and Israel moved on the Suez Canal, expecting a quick, contained operation, backed by what they assumed was tacit American approval. Washington pulled the financial rug out from under London within days, and the operation collapsed, not because of battlefield failure, but because the economics became untenable the moment the guarantor withdrew support. Sound familiar? Great powers don't usually lose wars on the battlefield anymore. They lose them in treasury departments, in bond markets, in the quiet moment when the people funding the war decide the juice isn't worth the squeeze. Keep that historical pattern in your back pocket, because it's about to become relevant again in a way you won't expect. And I want you to sit with that cost for a second, because this is where it gets uncomfortable for anyone still repeating the total victory talking points on cable news. There were reportedly 2 brutal pressures pushing toward an exit. First, there was no viable follow-up strike left on the table. Not "we chose restraint," not "we're playing the long game." There was simply nothing left to throw. If a knockout blow had existed, it would already have been used. The silence that followed wasn't patience. It was the sound of running out of road. Second, and this one might be even more important, the American economy reportedly could not absorb a prolonged conflict. There are reports that people inside the previous administration privately invoked comparisons to Herbert Hoover, the president history remembers as the man who presided over the start of the Great Depression. Think about what it means for that comparison to even be whispered in a war room. That is not a comparison a sitting government reaches for casually. When the people who designed a war start quietly worrying about being remembered as the ones who tanked the economy on top of everything else, the entire internal conversation has already shifted. It's no longer, how do we win this? It's, how do we get out of this without it looking like we lost? And here's why that Hoover comparison matters so much more than it sounds like on the surface. Energy markets were already jittery. Inflation numbers were already fragile. A drawn-out conflict in a region responsible for a meaningful share of global oil flow doesn't just cost money in the abstract, it shows up in gas prices, in shipping insurance, in every single supply chain that touches the Strait of Hormuz. And the people running the numbers inside that administration reportedly understood exactly what a 6-month version of this war would do to an economy that was already walking a tightrope. That's the part that never makes it into the headline coverage. The war didn't end because of a diplomatic breakthrough. It ended because someone looked at a spreadsheet and got scared. Now here's where the story stops being about two countries and starts being about the entire architecture of Middle Eastern security. Because the fallout doesn't stay contained to Washington and Tehran. It ripples outward to every government that built its entire defense posture on one assumption: that American protection was ironclad, unconditional, permanent. Think about the Gulf states: Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, Saudi Arabia. For decades, their whole security calculus rested on a single load-bearing belief. If it ever came down to it, the American umbrella would hold, no questions asked. That belief just absorbed a direct hit. Because if the United States can be maneuvered into a war it didn't actually want, fight that war clumsily, and then negotiate away nearly every point of leverage it walked in with, what exactly does that umbrella still guarantee? I wouldn't be shocked if you start seeing quiet diplomatic back channels opening between Gulf capitals and Tehran in the coming months. Not because anyone in Riyadh or Doha suddenly trusts Iran, because hedging your bets becomes the only rational move the moment your primary guarantor's credibility takes a hit this visible. And this isn't a one-time recalculation that happens quietly and then goes away. It's the kind of shift that compounds. Once a government starts hedging, it doesn't usually stop at one back channel. Defense procurement conversations start including options that weren't on the table 5 years ago. Sovereign wealth funds start diversifying their political exposure the same way they diversify a portfolio. Military cooperation agreements that used to be exclusive start quietly becoming non-exclusive. None of it gets announced. None of it shows up as a headline on the evening news. But intelligence services in capitals well beyond the Gulf are almost certainly running the same simulation right now, asking the exact same question. If the guarantor's word wasn't good enough for Riyadh, why would it be good enough for us? That's the part of this story that takes years to fully play out. And by the time it's obvious to everyone watching, the realignment will already be finished. And it isn't just the Gulf states doing this math. Turkey has its own calculations running. So does Egypt. So quietly does Pakistan, which has watched every twist of this conflict with one eye on its own nuclear posture and its own relationship with both Washington and Tehran. None of these governments are going to announce a shift in doctrine on the evening news. That's not how this works. The shift shows up months later, in a trade deal that seems oddly generous, in a defense procurement contract that goes to a supplier nobody expected, in a state visit that gets minimal press coverage but enormous private significance. Watch the quiet moves, not the loud statements. Because the loud statements are for domestic audiences, and the quiet moves are for survival. But here's the actual mystery. Here's the part that should be keeping serious analysts up at night, because it's the piece almost nobody is asking out loud. How did this war even start in the first place? Because according to the internal record that's leaking out, nearly every senior advisor in the room reportedly argued against launching this operation. And the intelligence community's own institutional history backs them up. There is no documented case anywhere of air power alone producing regime change. None. Zero precedent anywhere in the historical record. So you've got a decision that ran directly against expert advice, directly against historical precedent, and directly against basic risk math, which leaves one obvious uncomfortable question hanging in the air. What changed the calculus? What convinced a notoriously cautious decision maker to greenlight something that nearly everyone around him reportedly thought was reckless? One explanation on the table is simple overconfidence. A prior strike months earlier had reportedly created a sense of unstoppable momentum, a belief that a single decisive hit could permanently cripple Iran's nuclear program for good. Stack on top of that a completely separate, unrelated success story out of Latin America, a fast regime change operation that, from a distance, looked like more proof of a winning streak. Never mind that the two situations weren't remotely comparable. One was a low-risk operation against an already collapsing government with essentially zero casualties. The other required convincing an entire nation's military command structure to defect in advance. But perception beats technical accuracy every single time in the room where the actual decision gets made.
It's time for Operation America 250. We're gonna go see Young Washington in theaters this 4th of July. Yeah! Now they expect us to walk through the front door and pay 30.
And it's entirely plausible that a string of apparent wins created exactly the psychological conditions for a much bigger, much riskier bet. Now here's theory number 2, and I want you to actually pay attention to this one, because it borrows directly from one of the most infamous intelligence failures in modern American history. April 1961. A newly inaugurated American president authorizes an invasion of Cuba using exiled paramilitary fighters instead of official American troops. Every serious internal assessment beforehand said the operation was doomed. It happened anyway. Why would anyone launch an operation they already knew would fail? Because according to the most persistent theory around that failure, the intelligence architects behind it may have understood exactly that going in and pushed forward regardless, betting that once the operation collapsed, the president would have no political choice left except to escalate and commit full American military force to finish what had already started. The invasion's success was never the actual objective. The trap it would spring afterward was the objective. Now take that exact playbook and lay it over the Iran situation. What if the people who designed this operation, intelligence officials inside a foreign government, working closely with a sympathetic prime minister, understood from day one that a shock and awe campaign wouldn't produce regime change on its own? What if regime collapse through airstrikes was never actually the goal? What if the real goal was entrapment? Get the United States invested just enough, inflict just enough damage, generate just enough political momentum that walking away becomes politically impossible, and then let escalation run its natural course, dragging Washington into the full commitment a smaller strike alone could never achieve. There's a detail here that makes this theory a lot harder to dismiss than it should be. The current head of that country's intelligence service reportedly championed this exact plan with real enthusiasm. His predecessor, on the other hand, reportedly dismissed the entire concept as reckless and unworkable. Same institution, same intelligence, same access to the same information, completely different conclusion. Which tells you something important. This was never a matter of missing data. It was a matter of risk appetite and possibly a calculated bet on engineering a trap rather than pursuing an honest, achievable military objective. But here's the twist that actually separates this outcome from 1961. And it's the twist that changes everything about how this story ends. In the Bay of Pigs, the trap worked exactly as designed, right up until it didn't. The sitting president refused to escalate. He absorbed the full political humiliation of a failed operation rather than commit American forces to rescue it. And the fallout landed squarely on the intelligence architects who built the trap in the first place. The current situation appears to be tracing a strikingly similar arc. Initial commitment, deepening involvement, and then, right at the exact juncture where full-scale escalation was expected, a pullback. A reluctant recognition that doubling down carried economic and strategic risk that outweighed whatever winning would even mean at that point. Compare that to Vietnam, where the pullback never came in time, where sunk cost thinking took over and an entire decade got poured into a conflict that had already been strategically lost years earlier. Compare it to Afghanistan, where 2 full decades passed before anyone in power was willing to say out loud what most analysts had privately concluded within the first 5 years. What we're looking at here is actually the rarer pattern in American foreign policy, the pullback that happens early enough to matter before the sunk costs become politically unbearable. That's not nothing. That's the more surprising outcome given the historical baseline, which raises its own uncomfortable question. Was this genuine restraint, or was it simply that the trap had already served its purpose, and further escalation stopped being useful to whoever built it in the first place? Which brings us to the piece of this story that almost nobody is talking about, and it's the piece that actually matters most going forward. None of this is over. Nothing about the current arrangement is stable. Any ceasefire or negotiated settlement sitting on top of this situation right now rests on an extraordinarily fragile foundation. And there are multiple actors on the ground with both the capability and the motive to blow it apart. Watch Lebanon. Watch the ongoing friction with Houthi forces in Yemen. Any one of a dozen possible flashpoints could reignite the exact chain reaction that dragged Washington into this fight the first time. And if the original design really was entrapment rather than outright victory, then whoever benefited from entrapment the first time around has every incentive to try the exact same play again, especially if the current settlement keeps looking, from the outside, like a win for Tehran. There's another layer to this that almost never gets airtime, and it's the media layer itself. Notice how the coverage of this entire episode split almost perfectly along pre-existing tribal lines, the moment the strikes happened. And notice how quickly that coverage moved on once the ceasefire language showed up. That's not an accident. Wall-to-wall coverage of an active strike generates ratings. A quiet, ambiguous, diplomatically worded climb down does not. So the incentive structure of the news cycle itself works against you ever getting the follow-up story that actually explains what happened. The cameras show up for the explosion. They don't show up for the spreadsheet meeting 3 weeks later where someone decides the war isn't affordable anymore. That's why you're hearing this analysis here and not on the evening broadcast. It's not because the information isn't available. It's because the information doesn't have a dramatic enough visual to justify the airtime. And by the time analysts have actually pieced together what happened, the news cycle has already moved 4 stories further down the timeline. And underneath all of this sits a truth that almost never makes it into mainstream coverage. The United States is not one unified actor making clean, centralized decisions from a single room. It's a collection of competing power centers, intelligence agencies, military branches, financial interests, and an increasingly influential technology sector, each running on different incentives, different risk tolerances, and sometimes flatly contradictory objectives. The CIA doesn't always see eye to eye with the Pentagon. The finance and tech world, which has more influence over foreign policy conversations now than at almost any point in modern history, doesn't always align with the traditional defense establishment either. So when you're trying to understand how a decision this consequential got made, despite near universal internal opposition, stop looking for a single mastermind pulling a single lever. Start looking at the messy, fractured, competing reality of how modern great powers actually stumble into war and out of it, often as a byproduct of internal rivalry rather than coherent strategy. There's one more thread worth pulling before we get to the ending, and it's the domestic political thread. Because wars like this one don't just get evaluated on a map, they get evaluated in polling data. Every administration that walks into a conflict like this is running 2 simultaneous calculations. What does victory look like strategically, and what does victory look like to a voter watching a 90-second segment on the evening news? Those 2 definitions of victory are not the same thing, and when they diverge, the second one usually wins. Because elections happen on a fixed calendar, and strategic outcomes don't. That's part of why the language around this entire episode got dressed up the way it did. Nobody in that administration was going to stand at a podium and say, "We ran out of options and the economy couldn't take any more."
The new Patriot Power Generator 2200X is a total game changer. And for America's 250th birthday, we're doing something we've never done before. This unit is strong enough to cycle a fridge for days, run critical medical devices like a CPAP and power lights, all while being silent, fume-free, and safe to use indoors. There's no expensive gasoline, no noise, and no toxic fumes. But here's the best part of this 250th birthday deal. Right now, when you get the 2200X, we're going to send you a brand new mini solar generator for free. They call it the Sidekick because it's exactly that. It's the perfect companion to your big generator. This one can power all your small devices while you're...
They were going to find the version of events that
Sorry.
could be spun into a talking war
Hit
and
the
out
like
of it,
button,
often as
please.
a byproduct of internal rivalry rather than
Nothing is
coherent
gonna
strategy.
happen
There's
for
one
the
more
day.
thread worth pulling before we get to the ending, and it's the
Crystal,
domestic
Janet,
political
hey,
thread.
Janet.
Because wars like this one don't just get evaluated on a map, they get evaluated in polling data. Every administration that
Because
walks
one
into a
of the
conflict like
power
this is
to
running
be
2
wicked.
simultaneous calculations. What does victory look like strategically, and what does victory look like to a voter watching a 90-second segment on the evening news? Those 2 definitions of victory are not the same thing, and when they diverge, the second one usually wins. Because elections happen on a fixed calendar, and strategic outcomes don't. That's part of why the language around this entire episode got dressed up the way it did. Nobody in that administration was going to stand at a podium and say, "We ran out of options and the economy couldn't take any more." They were
Marcy?
going to find the version of events that could be spun into a talking point survivable through a news cycle. And then they were going to move on to the next crisis before
I need for
anyone
y'all to
had
hit the
time
like
check
button.
the
Y'all
receipts.
came in and
That's
didn't
not-
hit the like button. Can y'all double tap the face of your phone or hit those 3 dots at the top right? I'll wait. Do y'all know how to hit the like button? Yeah. Some more of y'all can drop down if y'all can't hit the like button. And I mean that respectfully.
Room. It's a collection of competing power centers, intelligence agencies, military branches, financial interests, and an increasingly influential technology sector, each running on different incentives, different risk tolerances, and sometimes flatly contradictory objectives. The CIA doesn't always see eye to eye with the Pentagon. The finance and tech world, which has more influence over foreign policy conversations now than at almost any point in modern history, doesn't always align with the traditional defense establishment either. So when you're trying to understand how a decision this consequential got made, despite near universal internal opposition, stop looking for a single mastermind pulling a single lever. Start looking at the messy, fractured, competing reality of how modern great powers actually stumble into war and out of it, often as a byproduct of internal rivalry rather than coherent strategy. There's one more thread worth pulling before we get to the ending, and it's the domestic political thread. Because wars like this one don't just get evaluated on a map, they get evaluated in polling data. Every administration that walks into a conflict like this is running two simultaneous calculations. What does victory look like strategically, and what does victory look like to a voter watching a 90-second segment on the evening news? Those two definitions of victory are not the same thing, and when they diverge, the second one usually wins. Because elections happen on a fixed calendar, and strategic outcomes don't. That's part of why the language around this entire episode got dressed up the way it did. Nobody in that administration was going to stand at a podium and say, "We ran out of options and the economy couldn't take any more." They were going to find the version of events that could be spun into a talking point survivable through a news cycle. And then they were going to move on to the next crisis before anyone had time to check the receipts. That's not a conspiracy. That's just how modern political communication works under pressure. And it's exactly why you have to go looking for the receipts yourself instead of waiting for someone to hand them to you. So where does that actually leave us? A war that was marketed as a decisive victory turned out, on close inspection, to be a strategic collapse, quietly repackaged as diplomacy. A regional security order built across decades on the assumption of guaranteed American protection is now visibly cracking, and the countries that depended on it most are almost certainly running the numbers on alternatives behind closed doors right now. And an operation that ran directly counter to expert advice and historical precedent leaves open a genuinely unsettling possibility that entrapment, not victory, may have been the actual design from the very first meeting. One last thing before we get to the part I actually want your input on. Every single one of the actors we've talked about so far, Washington, Tehran, the Gulf states, the intelligence agencies on every side of this, is operating with imperfect information and incomplete control over outcomes they helped set in motion. That's the part that separates real geopolitics from the version you see in movies. Nobody sat in a single room and drew up a master plan that unfolded exactly as intended. What actually happened is closer to a dozen different actors, each pursuing their own narrow interest, each making locally rational decisions that combined into a globally chaotic outcome nobody fully controlled. The intelligence chief who pushed the entrapment plan may have gotten exactly what he wanted. The administration that pulled back may have genuinely believed it was choosing wisdom over ego. The Gulf states, quietly hedging their bets, may simply be doing what any rational government does when its guarantor looks shakier than it did a year ago. All of these things can be true at once, and none of them require a single, unified conspiracy to explain the outcome. That's actually the scarier version of this story, if you think about it for more than a few seconds. Not that someone was in complete control, but that nobody was, and the world just absorbed the consequences anyway. Here's what I want you to actually think about before you scroll away from this. Every single breakdown of this conflict fixates on the same three names: Washington, Tehran, Tel Aviv. Same three players every single time. But there's a fourth actor sitting quietly at the edge of this entire story who almost never gets mentioned, and whose position 24 months from now might end up mattering more than any of the headline names combined. A country that hasn't fired a shot, hasn't spent a dollar, and hasn't taken a single public position, and may be watching this entire alliance structure crack in real time from the most comfortable seat in the House. Think about who has spent the last several years quietly building infrastructure, trade routes, and long-term financing deals across this exact region without ever once picking a public side in any of its conflicts. Think about who benefits every single time two rival power blocks spend their treasuries fighting each other instead of competing economically. Think about who gets to walk quietly into the vacuum left behind once the traditional guarantor's credibility takes a visible hit, offering investment and infrastructure instead of airstrikes and sanctions, and gets welcomed with open arms by governments that are exhausted after decades of being someone else's chessboard in a game they never agreed to play. Who do you think that is? Drop your answer below and tell me your reasoning, because I've got a theory of my own, and I want to see if yours lands anywhere close to it before I lay mine out.
You're using cinnamon wrong, and your blood sugar is paying the price. Let me explain. This isn't your typical herbal book. It's a manual. Digestion issues? Flip to the gut section. You'll find ginger plus peppermint tea. Boil, sip, and watch the bloat ease off in minutes. Blood circulation? Page.
Donald Trump just wrapped up a deranged pre-July 4th speech at Mount Rushmore. Before Donald Trump gave his speech in South Dakota,
surprised he's not
by
trying to get his
Mount
face put on
Rushmore,
Mount
there was
Rushmore.
a massive
Rushmore.
hailstorm, and I think this is literally a sign from above. Just watch what was going down, and you can see how it literally looked like the presidents on Mount Rushmore were crying. Just take a look at the scene right here before Donald Trump gave his speech. Let's play it.
He wants his face up there.
And then Donald Trump's entire speech was focused on just being as divisive as possible. He basically was like, if you don't agree with MAGA, you're a communist, and we're going to come after the communists. We're going to exile you. We're going to destroy you. We're going to crush and destroy the communists. That's the whole speech. We're destroying the communists. It's also very low energy. He looked freaking horrible. Here, let's play this clip right here.
So on the eve of this 250th anniversary of American heritage, we resolve and swear for all to hear that the citizens of the United States of America will vanquish communism quickly. Don't let them take too much of your time.
Oh, wow.
You know they're wasting your time, don't you? But
No,
we're not
you
going to
are,
let
though.
them take too long or too much of our time as they play their games and send them into exile. We will send them quickly away, and we will continue to build our country bigger and better and stronger than ever before.
And then, again, this is supposed to be the
Y'all
pre-July
remember that
4th
he's trying to
speech,
send
where in
people
normal
away.
times, we would have a grown-up, an adult, a unifying person to bring us together. This should be a nonpartisan day. I hope we all agree with that freaking premise right there. But Donald Trump's like, you can be a communist or you're a patriot. You're with MAGA or we're going to hunt you down. Do you realize how dangerous this speech is? Here, play this clip.
You can be loyal to Karl Marx or you can be loyal to America. You can be a communist or you can be a patriot. You cannot be both. As for those who peddle Marxist lies about our heritage, tell our children that we live on stolen land or that our heroes were oppressors, they're doing something much worse than slandering our past. They are slandering and attacking our future.
Well, why are you
Not
trying
gonna
to
let that
delete it?
happen.
And then it's just deranged.
Yeah,
and
I keep
delusional,
asking y'all to hit
and
the
he's
like
and
button.
We're beating the hell out of Iran right now. We beat the hell out of them. We let them enjoy their little funeral that they're doing for the Ayatollah. But when the funeral's over, they're begging for a settlement. Just what you entered into it's the most despicable
And today
regime
he's saying
imaginable
that
here in
when
the
he
United
die,
States.
he gonna have more people
entered
at
into
his
a memorandum
funeral.
of understanding, you idiot. You held it up in Versailles. We can read the 14 points of the Memorandum of Understanding. Either follow it or don't enter into it in the first place. Actually, don't get involved in catastrophic and unlawful wars with genocidal Netanyahu, though you're a genocidal maniac as well. Here's what he says about Iran. Play this clip.
2 world wars, the Cold War, left America's enemies in the depths of history. We beat Venezuela in one day, and we knocked the hell out of Iran. They're dying to settle. They want to settle so badly.
He is such a liar.
We gave him a week off for a funeral because we're nice. So
just show you
No,
more
it's
of what
true.
it looked like before Donald Trump gave this speech. Mike Carter put up this video, half-dollar-sized hail out at Mount Rushmore ahead of Donald Trump's speech. Take a look right here. Reuben Jones showed a video of "We got hail at Mount Rushmore." Show the B-roll of that, folks. Here's how state regime media Fox described what was unfolding as there was a severe weather warning right before Donald Trump got there. Here, play this clip.
Well, I will get some breaking news here. They just said that there's severe weather on the way. In fact, they said hail could be coming, and they're urging everybody to get inside. We're going to stay here for just a second here. Senator Rounds, thank you so much. We're going to get to shelter, and thank you for being here, and happy 4th.
Welcome to South Dakota.
That's the weather. We're going to head to break right now. We're going to get some shelter, and we'll be right back for special report.
Here's how they were describing it on CNN. Let's play this clip.
And we will shortly, but there's no question that President Trump has been so fixated on Mount Rushmore. It is why he wanted to return here. You cannot see the presidents behind me because of the conditions in my umbrella, but Presidents Washington and Jefferson and Roosevelt and Lincoln now look like they have tears because of the rain.
Back to Donald Trump's deranged speech right now. Donald Trump's like, our ancestors
It
did
happened for a
not
reason,
shed
be rich.
blood. They did not shed blood
Our
for
hell broke
radicals
loose.
and lunatics who pillage our nation. Hey, why don't you look in the mirror, you traitor, you lunatic? Our founders are rolling in their graves over you and your fascist regime and how you've destroyed this country and made it a laughing stock of the entire world. You've destroyed America. That will be your disgusting legacy.
Hello,
Here, play
Hera.
this clip.
where we settled the West and conquered the skies. You know who those people are. But we will never let that happen. Our American ancestors did not shed their blood at Concord and Trenton, Gettysburg and Shiloh, Midway and Normandy, just so that a band of thieves, radicals, and lunatics could come in and loot, pillage our nation. Our heroes died to win, build, and to save, and to build truly a great country, the greatest country ever in the world.
Then Donald Trump is like, 2 years ago, again, this is supposed to be the July 3rd, July 4th unifying speech. They laughed at us. Now they respect us. Who respect us? By the way,
now they
you want to
rolling
see
on the
the
ground
list of
laughing at you.
countries that attended the funeral of the Ayatollah? You want to see how many countries want to be close with Iran right now? I'll pull up a list right now so you can see for yourself how many nations are there. Saudi Arabia was there. By the way, most nations were. You've managed to move the world away from the United States towards Iran. But here, play this clip.
Like us, every king, every prime minister, every president, they respect us more than any other country by far.
You're such
2
a
years
liar.
ago, they laughed at us. Now it's only respect. And I want to tell you, the best is yet to come.
And then Donald
They're
Trump
leaving
says,
you out
the
of
last
meetings.
administration, what they did is unforgivable. No, what's unforgivable is you genocidal maniac. What's unforgivable is how you dealt with COVID and killed millions of people here with your maliciousness and your incompetence. And, you know, the one thing that you have is you managed to con 30% of our population who, like, loves being treated like absolute shit. I don't understand it, but that's your superpower. But the rest
That's
of
all
the
they know.
freaking country, the 70% of people who are the real silent majority who now get louder and louder, need to stop this crap. Stop this fascist crap, and we need to get back to our democracy again. Here's what he says, this divisive speech here. Play this clip.
The leaps of progress, feats of strength, and acts of selflessness, faith, and hope that could only have happened right here. 2 years ago, we were laughed at, mocked, and a nation in decline. We were in very serious decline. Last administration, what they've done to us, we can never, ever forget that.
Then Donald Trump's like, he whines about not getting a Nobel Peace Prize. I stopped 8 wars. You didn't stop a single war. You've created 8, 10, 12 wars. You've created massive war, famine. You're responsible for the deaths of millions of people by cutting off USAID and all the warmongering you've done. But sure, play this clip.
Americans have won the most Olympic medals of any country in the world by far, the most Nobel Prizes. Well, they haven't given me one. Settled 8 wars, I still haven't gotten it. That's okay.
Then he goes on and goes, well, the Communist Party is made up of immigrants and criminals and everybody that doesn't want to work. What are you even talking
That's
about?
you.
What does that mean? You were born
He's
with a
describing
golden
himself.
spoon in your mouth. You ran out of daddy's money. You get bailed out, all of them. What are you talking about? Here, play this clip.
The Communist Party is made up of illegal immigrants,
You.
criminals, and
You.
everybody that doesn't want to work.
You.
Communism is a loser. It always was, and it is right now.
That's
It's
you.
a big loser. Look at the people that are promoting it. They are not the people you're going to follow. In 250 years, the free people of this land have accomplished more with our liberty than any other society has accomplished, even in thousands and thousands of years as you look back and you study.
Then he goes, but we're the hottest country. Everyone knows how hot. This is what it looks like to be hot. No, this is what it looks like to be pathetic. This is what it looks like to be laughed at. This is what it looks like to rapidly lose any credibility on the world stage. And it's disgusting. Here, play this clip.
And today we are the hottest country anywhere in the world. Everybody respects
Who wants
us.
to be known as the
Like no
hottest?
nation. Remember this, we're respected like no nation in the world is respected like us. Every king, every prime minister, every president, they respect us more than any other
Did
country
he
by
forget
far.
what King Charles
There you have it,
said
folks.
about
Let me know
him?
what you think. Hit subscribe. Let's get to 7 million subscribers. And thanks for watching, everybody.
Shout
Want
out
to stay
you,
plugged in?
Ben. Did he forget? I've been asking y'all to hit the like button. I've been on here an hour and 40 minutes. Hi, Kathy. Trump will never, ever, 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 never, ever, ever get a Nobel Peace Prize. No, he will not. I need for y'all to hit the like button. Only one person has hit it. Hit it. Boom, 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 boom. Hit it. Hold on. I'm waiting on my likes to go up.
Something extraordinary happened in the past 48 hours. Something genuinely extraordinary happened in the past 48 hours. And the mainstream coverage of it has been so fractured and so contradictory that most people watching this conflict do not have a coherent picture of what actually occurred and what it means for where this entire situation goes next. Let me give you that picture. All of it. On July 1st, Israel's defense minister publicly declared Iran's supreme leader a marked target for elimination. That is not a paraphrase or an interpretation. It is a direct characterization of a formal public statement made at a military ceremony. Israel's defense minister publicly declared Iran's supreme of what actually occurred and what it means for where this entire situation goes next. Let me give you that picture. All of it. On July 1st, Israel's defense minister publicly declared Iran's supreme leader a marked target for elimination. That is not a paraphrase or an interpretation. It is a direct characterization of a formal public statement made at a military ceremony, prepared in advance, delivered with full awareness of its audience. The Israeli defense minister said the supreme leader is marked. He said Israel has already struck Iran twice. He said a third strike remains on the table.
He said it on the record at a public event that was broadcast and transcribed. On July the 2nd, there was a report of Israeli aircraft entering Iranian airspace from the direction of Iraq, while an Iranian diplomatic delegation was in transit between the Doha negotiations and Tehran, prompting that delegation to make an emergency landing at an Iranian airport rather than continuing on its planned direct route, subsequently completing the journey to Tehran. On July the 2nd, there was a report of Israeli aircraft entering Iranian airspace from the direction of Iraq, while an Iranian diplomatic delegation was in transit between the Doha negotiations and Tehran, prompting that delegation to make an emergency landing at an Iranian airport rather than continuing on its planned direct route, subsequently completing the journey to Tehran by land under protection rather than air. On July 3rd, President Trump publicly walked back the Israeli threat, issuing a clear, direct statement that the United States is not going to kill Iran's supreme leader, confirming that this is not something that is going to happen, and doing so specifically to stabilize the nuclear negotiations in Doha that Israel's declaration had directly threatened to derail. 3 days, one of America's closest allies publicly marking the leader of the country. Washington is simultaneously trying to negotiate a nuclear deal with a demonstration of Israeli operational reach that made an Iranian diplomatic delegation land early and complete a diplomatic mission by road, and then the American president personally intervening to pull the threat back from the table in real time. If you want to understand the actual shape of this conflict on July 3rd, 2026,
they got a bag on his head.
Tells you more than any single military operation or any single diplomatic announcement since the Versailles Memorandum was signed 16 days ago. It is July 3rd, 2026. Let's build this picture completely. Let's start with what Israel's declaration actually was, because the surface reading of it as simply another escalatory threat misses the specific operational and political logic behind it. And missing that logic means missing the most important thing happening in this conflict right now. Israel's defense minister did not make a casual remark at a press conference. He made a formal public statement at a military memorial ceremony. That distinction matters enormously. Military memorial ceremonies in Israel carry specific institutional weight. Statements made there are prepared, reviewed by legal and security advisors, cleared through appropriate governmental channels, and delivered with full awareness that they will be treated as official policy rather than personal opinion. The venue was chosen, not stumbled into. The specific language used, that the supreme leader is marked, that 2 strikes have already occurred, that a third remains possible, is the vocabulary of operational designation rather than political rhetoric. In Israeli security culture, the phrase marked for elimination carries a specific meaning that extends well beyond diplomatic warning. It describes a targeting decision that has entered the planning process, not merely a political threat that exists in the rhetorical domain. To understand why this declaration was made at this precise moment, you have to look at what was happening simultaneously in the nuclear negotiation track. Iran's parliament had just passed a law specifically prohibiting inspection access to bombed nuclear sites. Iran's parliament speaker and chief nuclear negotiator had gone on state television to call reports of a nuclear inspection agreement a lie. Iran's foreign ministry was simultaneously issuing statements about the Doha talks making positive progress. Iran's military was simultaneously warning that all oil tankers must use Iranian-approved routes or face an immediate and forceful response. Israel's declaration was not made in a vacuum. It was the response to a specific and observable pattern. Iran's parliament had just legislated away the single most important verification requirement in the entire American negotiating position, while simultaneously characterizing the negotiations as going well. What Israel communicated, delivered to all relevant audiences simultaneously, was this: if the diplomatic track is being used as cover for establishing legislative and institutional facts that make nuclear verification permanently impossible, there's another track available, and the person at the formal apex of Iran's decision-making structure needs to understand that his physical security is part of the calculation. That message has specific audiences beyond the obvious ones. It is addressed to Iran's supreme leader directly, whoever and wherever he currently is. It is addressed to the IRGC's hardline factions who have been acting with apparent independence from Iran's formal negotiating position, signaling that the costs of continued defiance extend beyond the individuals making specific operational decisions to the entire leadership structure they operate under. It is addressed to Washington, serving as a reminder that Israel's operational timeline is not subordinate to the American diplomatic calendar. And it is addressed to Iranian pragmatic negotiators in Doha, providing them with a specific, immediate, and personal argument for why closing a genuine deal quickly serves their own survival interests rather than simply national economic interests. The Iranian diplomatic delegation's emergency landing adds a specific operational dimension to this broader strategic messaging. Getting a diplomatic aircraft to land early by entering its airspace is a demonstration of capability that requires no kinetic action and creates no casualties while communicating an extremely precise message. You are trackable. You are reachable. The infrastructure protecting your diplomatic movement, including Pakistani escort aircraft, is insufficient to prevent Israeli reach into Iranian airspace. The people in those aircraft completed their return to Tehran by road, which means they had hours to think about exactly what the interception meant and what it implied about every other movement their leadership makes. President Trump's rapid public intervention to walk back the threat revealed several things simultaneously. First, there was insufficient coordination between Washington and Jerusalem on the timing and content of the Israeli declaration, which is itself a significant data point about the current state of U.S.-Israeli operational synchronization on this specific conflict dimension. If Washington had been fully briefed in advance and approved the declaration, there would have been no need to publicly walk it back within 48 hours. Second, the administration assessed that the Israeli declaration was operationally dangerous to something Washington is currently trying to protect. The speed of the public response indicates genuine urgency about preventing the Doha process from collapsing, which itself tells you the administration believes the Doha process remains viable and worth protecting. If Washington had privately concluded that talks were already failing, the urgency to walk back a threat that complicated them would be considerably lower. Third, Trump's public statement is, necessarily, a statement about American intentions rather than Israeli intentions. The President of the United States cannot commit Israel to a course of action any more than the Israeli defense minister can commit the United States to one. This is understood by every party watching the situation, including Iran's leadership. Washington said it will not pursue this option. Jerusalem has said it might. Both statements remain simultaneously true. What this creates is a specific and deliberate strategic ambiguity that benefits the American negotiating position in ways that are worth examining carefully. Iran cannot discount the Israeli threat simply because Washington has walked it back. If Iran believed that the American statement fully neutralized the Israeli declaration, the pressure that declaration was designed to create would evaporate entirely. Iran has to continue operating with the awareness that Israel's operational decision is not fully subordinate to Washington's diplomatic preferences. The ambiguity itself is a negotiating tool, even if it was created through insufficient coordination rather than deliberate design. Now, let's talk about what Iran's supreme leader situation actually looks like. Because the person at the center of both Israel's threat and Washington's reassurance is himself an extraordinarily opaque figure whose actual condition and decision-making capacity remain genuinely uncertain in ways that have direct implications for whether any negotiated deal can actually be delivered by the regime that would need to implement it. The current supreme leader was elevated to his position following his father's elimination in the Operation Epic Fury strikes of February 28, 2026. He is the nominal head of the Islamic Republic. In theory, his authority supersedes the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard command structure, the parliament, the foreign ministry, the entire governmental apparatus. In practice, the observable evidence about how he is actually functioning tells a story that is considerably more complicated and considerably more concerning from a stability standpoint than the official Iranian narrative suggests. He has not appeared on camera in over 4 months. Iranian state media has been running archival footage and imagery rather than current documentation. There have been reports suggesting AI-generated content is being used to maintain the appearance of a functioning leadership presence because authentic current footage simply does not exist in sufficient quantity to sustain the narrative. The Iranian public has not seen their supreme leader verifiably on camera since before the February strikes. American and Israeli intelligence officials have provided characterizations, reported in major publications, indicating the supreme leader was wounded, cut off, and initially unresponsive to communications following the February 28th strike. The Director of National Intelligence reportedly told congressional oversight that he was very seriously wounded, and that the decision-making coherence of Iranian leadership remained unclear as a direct result. Reports drawing on multiple intelligence assessments suggested injuries to his extremities and subsequent medical complications requiring multiple surgical interventions. Iran's official position is that he experienced only a minor injury and is in perfect health, exercising full command authority. The evidence for that claim is 0 verifiable public appearances across 4 months, during which his government has been managing the most consequential military conflict in the Islamic Republic's history. His physical security architecture reflects the regime's genuine awareness that he remains a priority target. Officials summoned to meet with him reportedly travel the final portion of their journey in blacked-out vehicles, are taken through tunnel systems while blindfolded, and emerge unable to reconstruct the route from their own experience. The tunnel network is designed to run under schools, hospitals, mosques, and residential neighborhoods, specifically because strikes on that infrastructure require collateral damage assessments that complicate Western military targeting decisions. His location is protected not just by physical distance and underground construction, but by the legal and moral costs that any strike would impose on the attacker. The man who is supposed to be making the decisions that will determine whether Iran's parliamentary inspection ban is reversed or maintained, whether the IRGC's hardline factions are directed toward genuine compliance or continued defiance, and whether the Doha talks produce a genuine final agreement before the 60-day window expires, is operating from inside a blindfolded courier tunnel network with injuries whose severity remains publicly unconfirmed. Now, let's connect this to the parliamentary inspection ban because it represents the most consequential single development in the post-ceasefire period, and the one that most directly implicates the question of whether this conflict achieves its stated objectives. Iran's parliament passed legislation specifically prohibiting inspection access to bombed or damaged nuclear sites under any circumstances. The sites specifically protected by this legislation are Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. These are not peripheral facilities. These are the core of Iran's nuclear program. The sites where enrichment happened, where centrifuges operated, and where the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator strikes during Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2025. Subsequent strikes during Operation Epic Fury in February 2026 were specifically targeted. These are the sites where the approximately 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium that the entire nuclear negotiation is supposed to account for was located. Without inspection access to these specific sites, no external party can determine whether the enriched material has been destroyed, relocated, partially salvaged, or is being reconstituted. The ambiguity about what survived those strikes cannot be resolved without someone physically going inside and looking. Iran has now made that physically going inside and looking domestically illegal. The mechanism matters as much as the outcome. Passing a law is considerably harder to reverse than a negotiating position because it requires parliamentary action to undo rather than simply a different diplomatic formulation. Iran's hardline parliamentary majority can block any reversal attempt procedurally, regardless of what the executive foreign policy apparatus might prefer to offer in a Doha negotiating session. The inspection ban has been insulated from executive reversal by the same parliamentary process that created it. This is exactly the kind of fact-creating action we have been tracking throughout the post-ceasefire period. The Persian Gulf Strait Authority, created within days of the Versailles signing to administer transit through the waterway, the memorandum committed to opening. The permit requirements issued for commercial shipping in the northern corridor, the public declarations that Hormuz is under Iranian command rather than subject to international maritime law. Each of these actions converted a diplomatic position into an institutional or legal fact that is harder to undo than it was to create. The inspection ban is the most consequential of these fact-creating actions because it specifically forecloses the deliverable that the entire military campaign was designed to produce. The cost of Operation Midnight Hammer, Operation Epic Fury, the naval blockade, the carrier strike groups, the 5,000 American personnel casualties treated as classified or not publicly disclosed in any single confirmed figure, all of that was paid in service of eliminating Iran's nuclear weapons capability in verifiable form. The parliamentary inspection ban is Iran's method of ensuring that verification never happens, while collecting the economic benefits of the memorandum that were supposed to come in exchange for that verification. Now, let's talk about the broader internal Iran pressure picture, because it provides essential context for understanding why the inspection ban may be more fragile than it appears despite having been legislated into domestic law. The Kurdish insurgency in the western Zagros mountain provinces is consuming IRGC ground forces and organizational bandwidth in a second operational theater the regime did not expect to manage simultaneously with the Strait of Hormuz situation and nuclear negotiations. Coordinated multi-province attacks across more than 200 kilometers of mountain terrain using small ISR drone platforms and FPV attack systems that the IRGC's historical counterinsurgency toolkit was not designed to address are creating a genuine second front that diverts resources the IRGC needs for its external pressure operations. Urban resistance networks in Tehran, Isfahan, and Tabriz activated in a coordinated poster and graffiti campaign in late June, demonstrating organizational coherence that went beyond simple spontaneous protest activity. These networks have demonstrated the ability to coordinate timing across multiple cities simultaneously, which is a specific operational capability that suggests external support or significant internal organizational development. The IRGC's senior naval commander most closely associated with strait closure enforcement died on a highway in southeastern Iran in late June, under circumstances Iranian authorities explicitly urged against speculating about. The pattern of public statements surrounding the death, specifically the warning against speculation from the IRGC's own media platform, follows what analysts have historically identified as the Iranian regime's standard approach to sensitive eliminations that it cannot publicly attribute or acknowledge without triggering mandatory escalatory responses. The Supreme Leader himself is operating from underground tunnel networks with injuries of uncertain severity, exercising whatever command authority he retains through blindfolded courier protocols that American officials have reportedly described as resembling complete disorganization in its dysfunctional effect on governmental coherence. And now, layered on top of all of this, an Israeli defense minister has publicly declared this Supreme Leader a marked target, and Israeli aircraft have demonstrated the ability to approach Iranian diplomatic aircraft in transit within Iranian airspace. The intersection of all of these simultaneous pressures is what makes the inspection ban law specifically important to watch in the coming days, despite its current apparent legal solidity. A parliament can pass a law under one set of circumstances and find itself facing overwhelming pressure to revise it under different circumstances. The parliamentary factions that passed this law did so in a political environment where the regime still appeared to have sufficient internal coherence and external leverage to sustain its defiant posture. If the Kurdish insurgency escalates further, if the Supreme Leader's command authority continues to appear unclear, if the economic pressure from any reimposed enforcement measures begins to bite again, and if the Israeli threat creates genuine uncertainty about the survival of leadership figures who benefit from the current legislative stance. The political calculation that produced the inspection ban may shift considerably faster than conventional legislative analysis would suggest. Now let's examine the technical state of the nuclear program itself, because this is ultimately what everything else is being structured around. The enrichment infrastructure at Fordo and Natanz absorbed GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator strikes, specifically targeting the deepest vulnerable points of those facilities. The double tap technique, delivering two weapons in sequence to the same GPS coordinate to maximize combined penetration depth, was specifically employed to address the granite mountain geology at Fordo. Post-strike seismic monitoring detected ground motion signatures consistent with deep detonations rather than surface-level explosions, suggesting the weapons performed as designed rather than detonating prematurely above the centrifuge chambers. But here's the genuine uncertainty that the inspection ban is specifically designed to protect. The Isfahan facility, which absorbed different strike types than Fordo because its underground geometry differs from Fordo's, specifically in ways that require different approach angles, reportedly saw truck movement near tunnel entrances in the weeks before the June 2025 strikes. Satellite imagery captured what appeared to be loading activity, consistent with material being moved into tunnels or between tunnel systems in the period immediately preceding the strike window. That material, if moved before the strikes, would not necessarily have been in the chambers that were actually struck. The WC-135R Constant Phoenix nuclear sniffer designed to detect atmospheric signatures of radioactive material being processed or handled has been operating continuously in the region since before the first strikes. Its presence detects atmospheric evidence of nuclear material activity without requiring physical site access. But the Constant Phoenix tells you that material exists and is being moved or processed. It does not tell you with precision where the material currently is, how much of it there is, or what condition the centrifuge infrastructure capable of further enriching it is in. Those specific questions require someone physically inside those facilities examining them directly. The inspection ban prevents that examination. The Constant Phoenix keeps detecting signatures that tell analysts the material is somewhere. Nobody's allowed to go find out exactly where or in what condition. This is the strategic logic behind the inspection ban from Iran's perspective. Permanent ambiguity about what survived and what capability for reconstitution exists is itself a form of deterrence. If the international community cannot verify that Iran's nuclear program has been truly eliminated, it cannot be fully confident that it has been. That residual uncertainty imposes caution on any future military decision-making about Iran, even absent actual verified capability, because the cost of being wrong in that calculation is catastrophic. Iran is using legislated inspection denial to convert uncertain survival of some portion of its nuclear capability into permanent strategic ambiguity that functions as a deterrent, even if the actual surviving capability is minimal. The parliamentary vote did not protect existing capability. It protected the ambiguity about whether any capability survived. Now let's talk about what actually happens next, because the remaining days of the 60-day window will be the most consequential in this entire conflict's history, and the decision matrix available to each party is both specific and important to understand. Washington has three primary options available to it in the remaining window. Option one is accepting managed ambiguity as the outcome, extending the negotiating timeline, treating the inspection ban as a diplomatic problem rather than a deal breaker. and allowing economic normalization to continue while seeking incremental progress on verification through whatever partial access Iran might eventually be willing to offer to non-bombed facilities as a face-saving compromise. This option preserves the diplomatic track and avoids immediate reimposition of enforcement pressure, but it functionally allows Iran to collect the economic benefits of the memorandum without delivering the verification commitments that were supposed to be the American gains from the deal. Option 2 is making the inspection ban a genuine deal-breaker, communicating clearly to both Tehran and Doha mediators that the existing economic benefits will be frozen and enforcement reimposed if the ban is not reversed within a specific time frame, using the maintained naval posture and the threat of renewed blockade as the mechanism to force a different parliamentary calculation. This option uses the leverage that was deliberately maintained throughout the window rather than drawn down, but it risks collapsing the negotiating framework entirely if Iran's response is defiance rather than accommodation. Option 3 is coordinating more explicitly with Israel rather than publicly distancing from Israeli pressure, allowing Israeli operational freedom on the supreme leader targeting question to create parallel pressure that Washington maintains formal deniability about while privately not preventing. This option uses the strategic ambiguity of the U.S.-Israel coordination question as a lever without requiring Washington to directly threaten something it has just publicly said it will not do. Each of these options has significant costs and risks. None of them is obviously correct. The one that is chosen, whether through deliberate decision or through the accumulation of smaller choices over the coming days, will define what the February 28th conflict actually achieved. Iran's options are more constrained but still meaningful. Iran can reverse the inspection ban through parliamentary action, which requires both executive direction and sufficient parliamentary votes to overcome the hardline majority that passed it. Given the internal pressure picture described above, this is more possible than it appears on the surface if the right combination of inducements and threats is structured. Iran can offer limited inspection access to non-bombed sites as a partial compliance measure that is presented publicly as a concession, while leaving the core question of the bombed sites unresolved. This middle path is likely the Iranian preferred outcome, since it appears to offer something while protecting the ambiguity that serves as the nuclear program's remaining deterrent value. Iran can simply run out the clock, accepting whatever consequences come with the window's expiration and betting that American domestic political considerations, European economic interests in Iranian oil, and Chinese diplomatic pressure will prevent a return to the full enforcement posture that drove Iran to Versailles in the first place. What happens in the next 30 days will determine which of these paths each party chooses, and whether the choices made are adequate to produce the outcome that the entire cost of this conflict was supposed to purchase. The Israeli defense minister said the supreme leader is marked. Trump said that is not going to happen. Iran's parliament passed a law making inspection access illegal. The Doha talks are supposedly making progress nobody can specifically describe. 30 days remain on a 60-day clock that started with higher hopes than the current situation justifies. The enriched uranium is somewhere in the Iranian mountain network. The Constant Phoenix is still detecting it. Nobody's allowed to go see where it is. The man responsible for the government that passed the law preventing anyone from going to see is running that government through blindfolded couriers and underground tunnels, while an Israeli defense minister has publicly said he is a marked target. This is the actual state of the most consequential nuclear negotiation in the 21st century as of July 3rd, 2026. Not what either side's press releases say it is, what the observable facts say it is. The next 30 days will tell us whether the military campaign that cost everything it cost actually achieved its stated objective, or whether it produced an expensive pause that Iran has used to legally entrench the ambiguity it needs to eventually reconstitute. Watch the inspection ban. Watch whether it gets reversed, amended, or remains intact as the window expires. That single data point will tell you more about whether this conflict produced a genuine outcome than any statement from any government about the progress of any negotiating round. The clock.
The clock is ticking. I got one more, and then I'm crashing out.
just about everything in American politics. You know, folks, I've been around long enough to see just about everything in American politics. I've seen moments that made me proud, moments that made me worried, and moments that made me scratch my head and wonder if we're all watching the same country. But yesterday, July 1st, 2026, something happened in Medora, North Dakota that I think deserves more attention than it's getting. The President of the United States stood up in front of 3,000 people and told them he just had a conversation with Theodore Roosevelt.
What?
Now, before you react to that, let me tell you.
What?
The full story is stranger than the headline. We're all watching the same country. But yesterday, July 1st, 2026, something happened in Medora, North Dakota that I think deserves more attention than it's getting. The President of the United States,
Theodore Roosevelt,
stood up in front of 3,000 people and told them he just had a conversation with Theodore Roosevelt.
Wow.
Now, before you react to that, let me tell you, the full story is stranger than the headline. And what it reveals about where we are as a country
Wow.
is something every American ought to think about. Because this wasn't just a quirky moment at a ribbon cutting. This was a sitting president
Hey,
at the
Big Al.
dedication of a presidential library, using the legacy of one of our greatest leaders
Wow.
to advance an agenda that Theodore Roosevelt himself would have fought against. And I read a sharp breakdown of exactly this contradiction in the Blue Bill before I even
Hold
watched
on,
it.
y'all.
The President of the United States stood up in front of 3,000 people and told them he just had a conversation with Theodore Roosevelt. Now, before
Time
you react
traveler.
to that, let me tell you, the full story is stranger than the headline. And what it reveals about where we are
Y'all
as a
please
country
hit the like button.
is something every American ought to think about. Because this wasn't just a quirky moment at a ribbon cutting. This was a sitting president.
I asked y'all nicely to hit
dedication-
the like button. Hit the three dots at the top right corner. I will wait. Get him up now. He talking about talking to Theodore Roosevelt. Get the likes up, please, or go, or leave. Only one person hit the like button. I'm gonna shut it down. Please, yeah, I'm finna shut it down. It's too late. For y'all to act like y'all don't have. Yeah, get out. No home training. Get your ass up out of here.
And told them He just had a conversation with Theodore Roosevelt. Now, before you react to that, let me
Trump
tell
said that
you,
he asked about
the
the
full
Panama
story
Canal.
is stranger than the
I even
headline,
had a conversation.
and what it reveals about where we are as a country
You had a conversation with
is
Theodore
something
Roosevelt
every
too?
American ought to think about. Because this wasn't just a quirky moment at a ribbon cutting. This was a sitting president at the dedication of a
Alfred,
presidential library,
can I get you to
using
hit
the
the like
legacy
button?
of one of our greatest leaders to advance an agenda that Theodore Roosevelt himself would have fought against. And I read a sharp breakdown of exactly this contradiction in the Blue Bill before I even watched the speech. One of the few sources left that'll actually walk you through what happened without spinning it for one side or the other. And what happened yesterday matters. We'll get into all of it, but first let me set the stage. The Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library is a $450 million project, privately funded, built on 93 acres near the entrance to Theodore Roosevelt National Park. It opens to the public on July 4th, the 250th birthday of this nation. Now that's a beautiful thing. I mean that sincerely. Theodore Roosevelt was one of the most remarkable human beings ever to hold the office I once held. He went to the North Dakota Badlands in 1884 as a 25-year-old man, grieving. His wife and his mother died on the same day in the same house. Can you imagine that? And he went out west and the land healed him. He came back a different man. He became the youngest president in American history. He built the Panama Canal. He signed the Antiquities Act. He created 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, protected 230 million acres of public land. He earned the title Conservation President. And he once said something I never forgot. He said, "The nation behaves well if it treats its natural resources as assets which it must turn over to the next generation, increased and not impaired in value." Now that is the man whose library opened yesterday. And when a sitting president shows up to honor that man, it should be a moment that unites us, a moment bigger than any one party, a moment to reflect on what public service actually means. And I want to give credit where it's due. Showing up, cutting the ribbon, bringing Roosevelt's Medal of Honor from the White House to the library, that's a generous gesture. That medal had been displayed in the Roosevelt Room at the White House, and presenting it to the library alongside the Medal of Honor earned by Roosevelt's son, who fought on D-Day, that is a meaningful act of historical stewardship. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. When a president does something right, you say so. But here's the honest truth, and this is where things start to get complicated. The visit itself quickly became something else entirely. The president toured the library privately, and during that tour, he interacted with an artificial intelligence exhibit built by Microsoft and a company called Lemon Slice. The exhibit is called Talk with TR. You walk up, swipe a bracelet, press a button, and you have a conversation with an AI version of Theodore Roosevelt.
Oh,
It's
wow.
built on his speeches, his letters, his books. And the president asked this AI hologram whether the Panama Canal was Roosevelt's greatest achievement. And Now here's the part that made headlines. He then told the crowd from the stage at the Burning Hills Amphitheater, quote, "I even had a conversation with Theodore Roosevelt." He said,
"You right."
"I said, what did you think about the Panama Canal?
It.
Do you consider that your greatest achievement? How do you feel about the fact that the Democrats gave the Panama Canal away to Panama for $1? Now, half the internet thought the man was confused. He wasn't. He was talking about the AI exhibit. But the way he framed it
Right.
tells you everything you need to know
New World
about
Order.
how this visit was being used. He
Yeah.
wasn't honoring Roosevelt.
He was probably mimicking. Y'all, please hit the like button. I hate to cut it off in the middle of this good information, but I need for y'all to double tap the face of your phone device or hit those three dots at the top right corner. 2 hours and 18 minutes in. I need about 20 people to hit the like button, or I'll shut it down and keep listening on my own. Trump, yeah, they were drifters, grifters, sorry and trifling, but they're not U.S. citizens. His last name, is not even Trump. Grumph, some mess. His last name is not Trump. Just like Bibi Netanyahu is not the Prime Minister of Israel's last name. Yeah. Trump. I don't know how to pronounce it. So I say Trump. Yeah. Come on, y'all, hit the like button. I'm getting sleepy. Come on, y'all. Double tap your device, your phone. If you're listening in, just tap it twice. If you're on your computer, hit those three dots in the comment section. It'll take you to the like button. Okay, that's my last time asking y'all. I'm going to cut it off.
He was using
Right when it
Roosevelt,
get good.
or at least a digital simulation of him, to make a partisan talking point about the Panama, talking about the AI exhibit.
He's so deceptive.
Now that is the man whose library opened yesterday. And when a sitting president shows up to honor that man, it should be a moment that unites us, a moment bigger than any one party, a moment to reflect on what public service actually means. And I want to give credit where it's due. Showing up, cutting the ribbon, bringing Roosevelt's Medal of Honor from the White House to the library, that's a generous gesture. That medal had been displayed in the Roosevelt Room at the White House, and presenting it to the library alongside the Medal of Honor earned by Roosevelt's son, who fought on D-Day, that is a meaningful act of historical stewardship. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. When a president does something right, you say so. But here's the honest truth, and this is where things start to get complicated. The visit itself quickly became something else entirely. The president toured the library privately, and during that tour, he interacted with an artificial intelligence exhibit built by Microsoft and a company called Lemon Slice. The exhibit is called Talk with TR. You walk up, swipe a bracelet, press a button, and you have a conversation with an AI version of Theodore Roosevelt. It's built on his speeches, his letters, his books. And the president asked this AI hologram whether the Panama Canal was Roosevelt's greatest achievement. And now here's the part that made headlines. He then told the crowd from the stage at the Burning Hills Amphitheater, quote, "I even had a conversation with Theodore Roosevelt." He said, "I said, what did you think about the Panama Canal? Do you consider that your greatest achievement? How do you feel about the fact that the Democrats gave the Panama Canal away to Panama for $1? Now, half the internet thought the man was confused. He wasn't. He was talking about the AI exhibit. But the way he framed it tells you everything you need to know about how this visit was being used. He wasn't honoring Roosevelt. He was using Roosevelt.
Right.
Or at least a digital simulation of him, to make a partisan talking point about the Panama Canal and to take a shot at Democrats. And I have to say, as a Democrat and as a former president, that framing is misleading. President Carter signed the Panama Canal treaties in 1977 after extensive bipartisan deliberation. The canal was transferred to Panama in 1999 during my administration in accordance with those treaties. It wasn't given away for $1. It was a negotiated act of sovereignty that the majority of the Senate ratified. Now, you can disagree with that policy. That's fair. But to stand in front of a crowd at a presidential library and reduce that entire diplomatic chapter to a partisan punchline using an AI that can't push back, that's not leadership. That's theater. And let me tell you something about the Medal of Honor moment, because this got less attention than it should have. After presenting Roosevelt's medal, the president looked at his two sons in the audience and said, and I'm paraphrasing loosely here, that he wanted to give one to himself and one to them. He said they'd have a threesome, his word. He talked about giving his sons the Medal of Honor for their genius at hunting and giving himself one for taking on Russia, 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 or something. Now look, I understand humor. I've told my share of jokes that didn't land exactly right. But the Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration this country gives. It is awarded for valor above and beyond the call of duty. Men and women have died earning it. Theodore Roosevelt's son earned his storming Utah Beach on D-Day. And to stand at the dedication of that man's library and turn the medal into a family joke, even if it was meant to be lighthearted, it tells you something about how seriously the office and its symbols are being treated. When I was president, there were moments where you just didn't go there. Not because anyone would stop you, but because the weight of the office reminded you that some things are sacred. The Medal of Honor is one of them. Now here's what really ought to concern every American, regardless of party. The president stood in that amphitheater, surrounded by Rough Rider reenactors, and praised Theodore Roosevelt as a man of ambition and pride and greatness. But what he did not do, and this was conspicuous to anyone who knows the history, was mention Roosevelt's conservation legacy. Not once. He talked about the Panama Canal. He talked about tariffs and William McKinley. He talked about grit and ambition, But he did not mention that Theodore Roosevelt protected 230 million acres of American land. He did not mention the national parks. He did not mention the Antiquities Act. And the reason is obvious, because the current administration has systematically dismantled the very conservation framework Roosevelt built. They've removed protections from over 100 million acres of public land across both terms. They've weakened the Endangered Species Act. They've rolled back the Bureau of Land Management's conservation rule. In June of this year, they issued an executive order opening more than 300 million acres of Pacific Ocean national monuments to commercial fishing. Interior Secretary Burgum, who introduced the president yesterday and who served as North Dakota's governor, has been leading the charge to streamline oil, gas, and coal development on public lands. And conservation organizations, including the Center for Western Priorities and the Center for American Progress, have called the comparison between Trump and Roosevelt a clear farce. The Blue Bill actually ran a thorough piece connecting these policy rollbacks to the library opening, and it's the kind of reporting that lays the contradiction bare without needing to shout about it. Roosevelt ended the Gilded Age. What we're watching right now, in many ways, is the return of it. And I want to be fair. There are areas where Trump and Roosevelt share common ground. Both had strong views on executive power. Both were willing to challenge political establishments. Both had big personalities. And the Supreme Court ruling this week that expanded presidential authority to remove heads of independent agencies, the president celebrated that from the stage, and he connected it to Roosevelt. He said the power had been taken away from another Roosevelt, FDR, in 1932, and that they just want it back. Now, there's a real policy debate to be had about the proper scope of executive power. But there's a difference between strengthening the presidency and weakening the institutions that check it. Roosevelt believed in a strong executive, but he also believed in the professionalization of the federal workforce. He believed in independent regulators. He believed that public servants should be insulated from political pressure, not subjected to it. What we saw this week was the court overturning 91 years of precedent that protected Senate-confirmed officials from being fired by the president at will. And if you combine that with the administration's approach to the civil service, DOGE, mass firings, the hollowing out of agencies, you're not strengthening government, you're concentrating power. And as the Blue Bill reported, the institutional implications of that ruling extend far beyond any single presidency. But let me tell you what concerns me most, and it's something I think about a lot. When a president uses the opening of a presidential library, a moment that should be about reflection, about history, about the long arc of the Republic, to denounce the Supreme Court on birthright citizenship, to call elected Democrats communist, to joke about giving himself the Medal of Honor, and to gloat about ripping 90 acres of protected federal land away from the Forest Service. His exact words were, "We ripped it away from the federal government. They don't know it's missing." What you're watching is the erosion of the line between ceremony and campaign rally. And that line matters. It matters because presidential libraries exist to hold our history in trust. They're not staging grounds. They're not backdrops for partisan speeches. When I go to a presidential library, any of them, I feel the weight of the office. I feel the responsibility. And I think about all the decisions I made that I'm proud of and all the ones I do differently. That's what those places are for. And when you take that space and use it the way it was used yesterday, arriving on a Qatari-gifted Air Force One that both parties have raised ethics concerns about, riding a flag-draped train through the Badlands like a victory lap, you're not honoring the presidency. You're performing it. Now look, I don't want to end on a dark note because that's not who I am and it's not what I believe about this country. America has corrected course before. We corrected course after Watergate. We corrected course after Vietnam. We built coalitions across the aisle to balance budgets, to expand trade, to invest in people. And I believe we can do it again. But it requires something from us, all of us. It requires that we hold our leaders accountable, not just for what they say, but for what they leave out. That we don't let historical revisionism go unchallenged. That we remember what Theodore Roosevelt actually stood for. Not the version that's politically convenient, but the whole man, the conservationist, the trust buster, the man who said the rights of the public to the nation's resources outweigh private interests. Those aren't Democratic values or Republican values. Those are American values. And on the 250th anniversary of this great nation, I think we owe it to ourselves and to every president who came before us to defend them. Not with anger, not with cynicism, but with the same quiet determination that sent a grieving 25-year-old from New York out to the Badlands of North Dakota, where the land made him whole and the country made him great. That's the story worth telling. And I hope when folks walk through that library this Saturday, that's the story they take home with them. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
Excuse me.